Hello. Okay, so this is the second of three videos for chapter 16. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. Schizophrenia is one of the most devastating mental disorders. It tends to have a much more biological kind of component when we think about it. I'll talk real briefly about some of the symptoms. You've probably heard a lot of these symptoms from your intro class or other abnormal classes. We often think about schizophrenia as being this split between emotional and intellectual aspects of experience. And we typically talk about the symptoms as being positive or negative. Positive symptoms we want to think about as being added, something that you have that you wouldn't necessarily see in a healthy individual. Negative symptoms is opposite, something that you're not seeing in the patient that you would expect to see in a healthy individual. So things like positive symptoms could be like hallucinations, delusions, or really rapid speech, disorganized speech. Negative symptoms might be a lack of speech or thought, so catatonia, that kind of flat affect, or just kind of a lack of any kind of social awareness. One of the other things that we will often think about with schizophrenia is this idea of cognitive symptoms. So this can also manifest in terms of like a negative symptom where you have cognitive deficit, so memory problems, attentional problems. Now, one of the main biological components of schizophrenia is that it has a fairly high concordance rate, meaning that monozygotic twins have about 50% chance that one identical twin has it. There's a 50% chance that the other one will also develop schizophrenia. But this is really carried by prenatal environment. So if they're sharing the same womb, basically, so you have a monochorionic, which is basically they're sharing the same sac, and dichorionic, which is where they're separated. There's two. You see that concordance rates goes up for the mono and down for the di. You also see this with dizygotic twins who are sharing the same fetal environment, but they don't necessarily have the same DNA, is higher than siblings who have the same amount of DNA as a dizygotic twin, but they're born at different times. So we know there's an interaction of genes and disordered family life, so multiple stressors. If there's other types of things going on in the home, that can cause stress. Just general life stress can lead to symptoms later in life. So some of the genes that we know, we probably think it's a lot of different types of genes, multiple genetic mutation, and possible like microdeletions, microduplications over many, many different genes. But one of the genes that seems to be most correlated with schizophrenia is this DISC1 gene, which seems to control production of dendritic spines, which may help explain some of the brain abnormalities that we see. So we do see quite a few brain abnormalities. One of the main ones is what we call hypoactivity in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. We've already been talking about the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, really important in learning, decision making, working memory, basically inhibiting controlling processes. Okay, so that executive functioning. When you see you put someone with schizophrenia in the scanner, you see that they're less that part of their brain is less active, and so that can explain a lot of their lower performance in attention and memory tasks that you might give them. We also see that the connections between many different brain areas seem to be fewer. And then we can also look at the actual shape of their neurons, and we see that the cell bodies of many of the neurons, particularly in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, are actually smaller. One of the other brain abnormalities that they've seen is a sort of progressive loss of gray and white matter, and this image kind of shows that, where you see how much brain gray loss they're seeing over time. It's much higher in the schizophrenic patients, and what they think that's happening is that the pruning, that process that is a normal process as a child, gets much slower when you reach adolescence. Doesn't seem to stop when you for people who have schizophrenia. So all of these deficits start to see that there. What you also see is reduced functioning in the inner neurons, the GABA inner neurons, which when we think of, remember GABA it's an inhibitory regulatory neurotransmitter. And so what we think it may be happening is that those dopaminergic neurons that are sort of regulated by these other inner neurons aren't being processing properly, so then they become inappropriately active or inactive, which can lead to both positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So one of the way that people think that this is happening is this, that during the brain's development, the brain develops differently in a way that causes these abnormalities. And so when we know that the brain is developing, neurons sort of, we get new neurons and then they become they move to where they're supposed to go, and then they can do their thing. So part of the neurodevelopmental hypothesis is that for folks who are prone to schizophrenia, what happens is that we have these interneurons, these neurons that are helping to create these connections between other neurons that don't seem to go to the right place. So you can see this is a healthy control, very nicely well organized neuron. Okay, all of the interneurons are sort of clearly placed in the right way. Here's the individual with schizophrenia, much more disorganized. So if these neurons don't go to the right place, it can disrupt the circuitry, which can then cause problems with improper activation or deactivation in these neurons. Okay. Another piece of evidence for the neurodevelopmental hypothesis is that people believe that abnormalities in the prenatal neuronal development can lead to the vulnerability. So we have seen correlations with maternal stress and substance abuse, delivery complications, as well as this really interesting season of birth effect. What happens is there's a small but significant effect of when you're born. So babies who are born in the winter tend to have a greater probability of developing schizophrenia. And some of the things that they've looked at are the role of the mother having the flu. So if your mom has the flu at the right time when the brain is developing the right things, that can disrupt some of that. Again, it's a small but significant effect. Other things they've linked to vitamin D deficiency. So in the winter, you're not getting enough sun, and that can also affect how the brains of the babies get developed. Okay. So there's a neurodevelopmental hypothesis that believes that it's about how the baby is developing. Another hypothesis is the dopamine hypothesis. And that's the idea that positive symptoms of schizophrenia are basically overactive dopaminergic neurons or dopaminergic synapses, okay, particularly the D2 dopamine receptor. And one of the main pieces of evidence for that is this being able to treat schizophrenia. The way we treat positive symptoms is basically blocking the dopamine pathway, okay, and we can reduce positive symptoms that way. So very clear sort of connection between you block the dopamine pathway, you block those symptoms. The other thing is that if you overactivate those symptoms, say with drugs like amphetamines, cocaine, you can induce positive symptoms. There's a really interesting connection between narcotics and schizophrenia. So one is with PCP or angel dust. If you take a strong enough dose, you can produce schizophrenic symptoms. We know that PCP is an antagonist for glutamate, particularly in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So glutamate is a activating neuron, right? So excitatory. So if it's an antagonist, it's stopping that. And we know that the people with schizophrenia have lower activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So if we're blocking that activation, blocking those neurons, then we can sort of see that why that might happen. Now, an interesting thing is PCP doesn't have the same level of effect in preteens who don't have the same development of that area and are still not going through the same level of pruning process that folks who are adults have, which might explain one reason why we don't tend to see symptoms for schizophrenia until late adolescence. Another thing that we've seen is LSD and amphetamines and cocaine all produce temporary psychotic schizophrenic symptoms. We know that those tend to decrease dopamine utilization. So the third hypothesis about what causes schizophrenia is it's not the dopamine itself, but the glutamate. Okay, so we know, yes, the dopamine is definitely involved in schizophrenia, but that's more of not the dopamine is sort of a secondary effect. So it's actually that increased dopamine can lead to decreased glutamate, and the glutamate we know is really important in long-term potentiation and other aspects of neural development, changing over time and neuroplasticity. So what can happen is that sort of the dopamine itself is sort of contributing to a lack of glutamate, which can then contribute to a lack of dopamine and have this kind of cyclical effect. So it's actually more about the glutamate than the dopamine. What we see is that people who have schizophrenia also have deficient activity in the glutamate synapses, especially the prefrontal cortex. And that's also what's happening in that PCP. We can explain why the PCP drug interaction happens. Okay. So the last thing I'll talk about with schizophrenia is treatments. So the first class of treatments was basically Thorazine, and these treatments pretty much only work on the positive symptoms. They've been around for a long time, but the problem is, one, they only treat positive symptoms, and two, the side effects were horrible. It's really hard to get people to take their medications if they can't stand the side effects. So typically today, what's been developed are atypical antipsychotics. And what those do is they work to treat both positive and negative symptoms. So they treat the negative symptoms by increasing actually dopamine activity in the prefrontal cortex. So that's where we have that hypofrontality, so kind of getting that to be more active and then getting that back up. But then, of course, still working on the positive symptoms by decreasing activity in the mesolimbic system. What's typically happening is that those drugs keep working on them to be more effective, but also have better side effects so that people can live with disorder and have more high-functioning life. All right, that's it.